Welcome to the Science of Tree Felling series. In this video, we're going to talk about the 3 proper ways to start a chainsaw and the 1 improper way to start a chainsaw. First and safest and easiest way to start a chainsaw is on the ground. With it being flat on the ground, you have optimal control over the saw. We talked about in an earlier video to reduce the resistance and the pressure against the starter cord. A lot of these larger saws are going to have a decompression valve. So before we start the saw on these larger saws, we'll push in the decompression valve. Next, we want to go to the back side of the saw and make sure that we are in a cold start if we haven't had the saw started before. Some saws have carburetors, some of them are electronic fuel injected now, and some of them have little computer chips that sit on top of the carburetor that automatically do things for you. Most saws are going to have the choke mechanism or the cold start mechanism engaged by placing our hands on the back handle, engaging the throttle fully, and then with our thumb pushing it into the full choke or cold start setting of the saw. With our saw on full choke or cold start and our decompression valve pushed in, we can pull on the handle, but we want to maintain control of the saw, and we want to think about the orientation and the plane of the bar and chain, always the business end of this chainsaw. Where is it in relation to our body? Starting the saw on the ground, I can immobilize the saw by placing the toe of my foot into the handle to start it, placing my left hand, securing it and pushing it down onto the ground. So now this saw is immobilized from any type of negative reaction that I wouldn't want it to move in. I can then grab the pull starting cord, and in the orientation that the pull starting cord is designed, when you pull the cord, you want to be able to see the cord drop down and enter into the saw. You want to pay attention to make sure that you're not pulling against any of this housing or that you're systematically damaging it by doing so. So when it's immobilized, I can pull straight out and I can get it to start. You may have to pull several times. You'll hear it pop. So it'll try to start because it's in full choke. It's not going to stay running. It may run for a brief period of time and then shut itself off. Depending on your make and model, you're then going to move your throttle into the half choke or high idle position. In this particular case, I just pull the trigger once and it automatically pushes it into the next position. Or the run position. Some other models, you may need to push up and put it on the half choke or high idle position and perform that same sequence again. And then when you pull on the trigger, you'll drop it into the full run position and your saw should idle. Now, once your saw is running and idling, you should not have to constantly fiddle around with the throttle to keep it running. The saw should be able to run on its own once it's started without any help from you whatsoever. Additionally, with the chain brake off, you should see that the chain does not move when the saw is idling. If the chain is advancing forward when the saw is idling, something is not right with the saw is dangerous, and it should not be used until it is repaired. So ground start is one way to start the saw, immobilizing it with our right foot and our hand. Additionally, if you have big boots on and you can't get it into this position, I've seen people put the rear of their shoe on that hand guard, that hand plate that we went over with our saw inspection. This is a little bit more dangerous, although immobilized, because now your leg is in that plane of the saw chain and bar. Additionally, I've seen people immobilize it with their knee on top of the power head. This works too, but it's a little bit less control over it than having your foot in here. But all of those are acceptable ways to immobilize a saw, as long as the saw doesn't move when you pull up on the starter handle. ground start. Chain brake on, engage full choke, or in this case, cold start mechanism. Pulling the trigger, pushing down with my thumb, releasing the trigger while still holding with my thumb, releasing thumb. Immobilizing saw with foot and hand, limiting its movement, pulling starter cord several times until saw starts. Once saw starts, because I have an electronic control mechanism on my carburetor, it will go automatically into high idle, at which point in time I can pull the trigger and put it in regular idle. Once it's idling, I will pull back on my chain brake and observe to make sure that the chain is not moving irregularity or while the saw is idling. This is for my carburetor, people. I have not run this saw in about 3 years. I just put fuel in it for the first time in a long time, and we'll see if this works. So, throttle interlock, full throttle, all the way back into the full choke position. The full choke position is the one with the lines perpendicular to each other. Chain brake on, and I'm going to pull till I hear it pop. If you have a decompression valve, now is the time. This little saw, no decompression valve. There it goes. Did you hear that? Just popped a little bit. Now, I'm going to push it one step forward into the high idle. The high idle kind of looks like the choke, but the lines are kind of curved in, and the choke plate is more at a 45-degree angle as opposed to perpendicular, and I'll show that here. All right, now when I give her a pull, she should run. When she runs, she's going to be a screaming banshee because it's on high idle. But I've got my chain brake on, and once it is revving at full idle or high idle, I will go ahead and stick my finger on the trigger and just a quick pop of the throttle. It'll take it out of high idle and put it into standard run mode. So let's try that next. There you go. I'm going to pop that chain brake off. Make sure that the chain isn't moving. And back down to idle, and the chain shouldn't be spinning with the chain brake off. So chain brake on, make sure it shuts off. Push of a button, and we're done. And that's how you start a carbureted chainsaw. The next way that I want to talk about is what's called a leg lock. A leg lock is just that. It's a leg lock. If you ever hear it called a crotch lock or something like that, I'll show you and advise you as to why not to do that. A leg lock is now through the same starting process, but the immobilization method is a little bit different. Instead of being crouched down on the ground, I'm standing up straight, and I'm able to, with the front of my left knee on the bottom side of the saw and the back of my right knee over the back handle, immobilize the saw in that plane, and my left hand again on the front handle to control the pivot point of that saw. So now the saw is immobilized in this fashion. It's locked between my legs, locked between my knees. And when I start the saw, again, the orientation of this cord, I want to move in the same direction as the cord is designed to exit the saw. So I'm going to pay attention that I'm not pulling up against that orientation. I'm not pulling back against the orientation. I'm pulling out. Again, this is not a very ergonomic way to start a saw. This motion in of itself is very detrimental to your shoulder and arm, and repeated use can cause damage over time. So this is the second way that you can start a saw. It's not the way that I would recommend always starting the saw, which on the ground is your most safe and advantageous way to do. But the leg lock is here. Now, why I don't advise a crotch lock. I see a lot of people jamming this up a little bit further than they should be. Again, you're going to have less control because your points of contact are a little bit tighter. And then what they're going to do is they're generally pulling up on this cord, which is going to cause damage to your starter cord. It's going to cause damage to the saw. But more importantly, the damage that I see is if they're not using the decompression valve, or if there's a lot of resistance or compression to this saw, the pivot point is in front of the saw, and now the force that you're applying is in the back, which is going to cause this reaction that's going to force the handle of this saw even further up, making for an uncomfortable situation. So always do a leg lock and pull out. Do not do a crotch lock and pull up, otherwise the consequences can be uncomfortable to say the least. Leg lock. Chain brake engaged. Immobilized in the front of my left knee, behind my right knee, pulling in the orientation of the starter cord. The last way to start a saw is with a locked arm. The locked arm way to start a saw is really one of the only ways that you can start a saw if you're in a bucket situation or if you're working aloft. It's very difficult when you're in a tree or in a small platform working aerially to set the saw on the ground and start it. It's very difficult to set it in between your legs and start it. So sometimes you're going to need to put the saw outside of the platform, or when you're in a situation when you're climbing, you're secured in multiple locations. And when you start the saw, you're going to stiffen your left hand and you're going to pull with your right hand on the starter cord. Now, this situation here, I'm only moving one arm at a time. I'm only moving my right hand when my left arm is stiff and controlling the saw. This is the least safe way to start the saw of the three because, again, I only have control over the pivot point. I don't have full control over the saw, and I need to be cognizant of that. It's a necessary evil to get the saw started. Arm lock start. Chain brake engaged. Stiff arm, only operating pull start with right arm. Now, the way that I want to show you in the variation of this method that comes into call all the time and called out for improper use, is rightfully so, is what's called the drop start. And the drop start is a variation of that stiff arm start, but you're actually moving both hands at the same time in opposite directions, where you're lowering your left hand and raising your right hand at the same time. This has even less control over the saw. You have two variables, one going down, one going up. And as you can see, just as I'm doing this action, as that rope catches, it wants to pull that chain and bar closer to my leg and closer to the fleshy bits of my leg, which would make for a horrible day. Also, we're causing more stress on that starter cord and starter mechanism when I'm going like this. I have less control to be able to see that the orientation of my starter cord is in line with the device as it's manufactured. So I'm going to cause more wear and tear on it. It's likely that I'm going to cause this systematic rubbing on the side of it. So it's not good all around. It's not good ergonomics. It's not good for your body to be throwing things and catching things. It's not good from a variable standpoint. I got two things moving in opposite direction, and it's certainly not good for the chainsaw as you're going to damage the starter mechanism. It's really, really hard on both you and the saw. Don't recommend it. And that is how you properly start a chainsaw, and one way to not start a chainsaw. Hey, if you like these videos and you found something interesting or learned something today, make sure you like and subscribe and continue watching the series. There's a lot of really good videos on here on how to become better. Maybe you're already skilled in tree felling or arboriculture, but it never hurts to hear another person's perspective and learn a little something along the way. So again, if you like what you're watching, like and subscribe, and keep on to the next series. See you next time.